Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the panel discussion. The topic of our panel today is blockchain and GDPR, and specifically the challenges that we face when we combine those two things. I think that most people have probably heard of GDPR. You know, at least you've all run into lots of banners on the bottoms of the web pages you go to asking you to consent to use of cookies. But I think today we're going to get into some of the details of why GDPR and blockchains have some conflict and how we can help them get along better together. So I'm going to let panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what they're doing, why they came to this, just for a minute or two, and then we'll get right into it. So.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. My name is Salman Basit, and I'm from IBM, and I manage the security identity of production blockchain solutions, including, the GDPR readiness for these solutions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Omke. I'm a principal at Promontory Financial Group, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of IBM. We're a global regulatory consulting firm. I work in our London office where we focus on data privacy and data protection issues, and my practice focuses on the overlap of GDPR and blockchain. Have been working with many of our IBM colleagues and clients on their implementations and the concerns that their implementations of blockchain have with regard to GDPR.
Well, hi, good morning. My name is Silvia Rodriguez. I'm a lawyer also in Spain and in the state of New York. I'm also certified in data protection laws, data protection privacy laws in Europe, and I'm an independent consultant. I work independently right now. I'm very interested in the intersection between the law and high-tech markets in general, now especially blockchain.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Miguel Sanchez. I'm a solutions architect and also an independent consultant. I implement solutions for large organizations in the US and also certify by the International Association of Privacy Protection, privacy professional in terms of European regulation. And right now, since 2017, I'm into the blockchain ecosystem, specifically Hyperledger technologies.
Well, thank you, everyone. So GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. It actually doesn't say privacy. Many people think the P stands for privacy, but it's actually about data protection generally. Let's talk about why GDPR is relevant to blockchain projects and why people may want to pay attention to it. We want to take that?
I think Joe wants to talk.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So there's a number of reasons why GDPR is relevant to blockchain, and I think one of the things that I spend a lot of my time talking with clients and potential clients about is just some misconceptions. I think there's a belief out there that GDPR and blockchain are mutually exclusive, that they are not compatible. And I think that there are a number of sort of big banner headlines of why that could be. For example, the GDPR has this right to be forgotten. There must be the ability to rectify personal data on any given system. There must be the ability to remove that data if requested, which seems to butt heads with the blockchain's immutability, and so there's this question of whether you can put personal information on a blockchain, which for a lot of solution architects will create problems and really limits the use cases. But I do think that there are opportunities here to make these two seemingly antithetical things work together. And I think that it just takes a little bit of creativity. It takes a little bit of understanding of what the GDPR actually requires of you, and an understanding of how to work your solution to meet those requirements.
And I will also add that the GDPR, the territorial scope of the GDPR, is very broad, and it touches, everyone should be noticing or giving it importance to the GDPR because it touches any establishment, any entity that wants to offer goods and services to the EU residents and citizens, and with the intent to do it or to monitor citizens or residents in the EU. So almost any company outside of Europe could be touched by the GDPR, and there are very high fines.
That's a great point that it's relevant to almost everybody,
Yes.
And it's impossible to get away from. So the GDPR, Joe, you mentioned the right to be forgotten, and that implies that there's somebody you can contact to ask to be forgotten, and that somebody is the data controller, and there's also data processors. Daniel, maybe, Miguel, would you like to talk to us about that, about the roles and how they come into play?
Yeah, well, first of all, people, when we talk about the right of erasure, we think that is like there's no way to escape from that. And actually, there are several exceptions. And actually, most of the cases, you can say, well, you actually don't need to remove the entire data. And in terms of blockchain, one thing that we should discuss is what actually means right of erasure and what is the information that you can or you should delete. And it's just only personal data. It's not any data. So if you have data about an organization, there's no such thing about right of erasure. We're talking about personal data that is related to a natural person. That's the first thing maybe we can discuss about personal data. And the thing is, even though you would like to remove that data, the controller, I mean the organization that is managing your data, could find a way, workarounds, we can say that, to not do it. Or as a last resort, to somehow, from the technological perspective, prepare the data so it's pretty much deleted, erased, in terms of accessibility or in terms of readability. So people are very scared about the right of erasure. I mean, innovators like, oh, I'm going to put something that, it's immutable. I can remove it from blockchain. But the thing is, I mean, if you think in advance and you design properly, and apply the technology that is currently available, you don't really need to be scared about that. Of course, you should be very careful in that area.
I would just add to that I think that controllers, the controller-processor relationship is one of the kind of major outstanding questions when it comes to designing GDPR-compliant blockchain solutions. And sorry, I'm not really sure sort of what the audience background is with GDPR. So one of the challenging things about GDPR is just there's a lot of definitions that we need to get through. When it comes to controller and processor, the controller in any given analysis will be the entity that is gathering or processing personal data that controls both the means and the purposes of that processing. And it comes with a whole bunch of obligations, requirements that are in contrast to being considered the processor, which is where you are processing data, but you do not control the purposes. So you are processing on behalf of another entity. So generally, that's pretty straightforward, right? Like if you are Google and you are gathering personal information, you are doing that as a controller. You are gathering that information for your own purposes. When it comes to a blockchain solution, where there are many nodes on the network, and all of those nodes contain personal data but are not necessarily using it, the distinction between controller and processor becomes a little bit more murky. And so figuring out who are the controllers, who are the processors, whether there are joint controllers, becomes a little bit more of a complex analysis in the case of blockchain. And then, of course, you get into distinctions between public versus private chains, permission versus permissionless. And so there's a whole analysis there that needs to be done with significant implications for the entity that is either setting up the blockchain in the first place or existing as a node on it. Because many entities can end up getting additional responsibilities under the GDPR that they didn't bargain for when they sort of signed up to the network.
Just one little thing. I don't want to hijack the conversation. I just want to add a little example to make it clear who's the controller. So let's say you have a Fabric network. All the private permissioned blockchain. So all the participants are going to be considered controllers. So they have the responsibilities from GDPR perspective, unless there is a designated controller. And even though if you are the controller of the whole network, the whole blockchain, because you determined the purpose and the means of the processing, you can find also another controller at another level. This is based on EU observatory reports and French data protection reports, combined with the recital 18. So whenever a participant of the network submits information on the ledger, is automatically considered a controller, but automatically could be considered a controller if there is a business activity involved, which means that you're going to have two controllers that are not joint controllers at different levels. So if you have your Hyperledger network, if you have a channel between two participants, they are going to be controllers of that information they are managing between them. And then at the same time, you have controllers for the entire network. So it's, as you said, Joe, it's difficult to find out exactly who's a controller, but at the end you have to find the factual circumstances and to look at that and determine that. So giving you that example about Hyperledger, I think for permissioned private network, it could be more, it could be easier than public. But regardless of that, at the end, there should be a controller behind the blockchain. That's the example I wanted to add.
Yeah, thanks. So Solomon, as you work with clients and partners on blockchain projects, what are some of the concerns that they have and how do you overcome those?
So, if anybody is trying to build a production blockchain solution and, you go and try to build a consortium or invite some people to use your blockchain as a service, that whole thing has to go and be vetted by the client team, including their security and compliance teams. And one of the first questions they would ask is, are you GDPR compliant? And if there's any production solution on blockchain that says we are not, that's a deal breaker. So why is GDPR important? Because if you're trying to sign up clients, that is a deal breaker. And of course, there's the whole personal data aspect to that. So, when trying to sort of create these production blockchain solutions on Hyperledger Fabric or any other blockchain platform, one has to sort of abstract things out and keep in mind as to what are some of the important things. Data collection is one aspect which I think Miguel and Joe alluded to. Who is the data controller? Who acquires the data? Who processes the data? So, for example, a bank may acquire the data and may process it on a cloud, hence the controller and the processor. But blockchain at its core is a immutable database, is immutable ledger. It stores things permanently, and it stores things in a distributed manner, right? And the GDPR says that you have to have a right of erasure. You need to give the people the right to modify things. And if you're going to share that information, you have to tell the people who you are sharing this information with. Right? So that's sort of the dichotomy in a nutshell. So we have to be able to explain to clients in very simple terms that if we are processing personal data, are we processing that personal data off-chain or on-chain, on blockchain? It is usually a good idea, if you don't know anything about GDPR, it's generally a good idea to start with by trying to avoid storing personal data on blockchain, right? But then you may ask the question, how is that possible? Can I build a production solution with without doing that. So what are some of the other techniques that could be used? And the techniques come into mind such as hashing or pseudonymization, which need to be vetted as part of the GDPR readiness, because a simple hash of, let's say, a name and putting that on blockchain is simply not good enough. It does not provide. It conflicts with the various properties I outlined earlier in terms of erasure, rectification, and notification before distribution of information. And on Fabric, and also on other permission blockchain platforms, I think it has also been alluded that implementing GDPR is slightly easier than public blockchain networks, but nevertheless, there is also the issue of liability, contractual liability that comes into play. So, for example, if one of the nodes or organizations acquired the data from some personal data from some entity and share it with one of the other organizations on Hyperledger Fabric, maybe anonymized fashion. And imagine if not all of the nodes have the same security controls, so one of the other organizations gets compromised. Then what is the liability of that organization, which are participating in a Fabric channel or in a blockchain network, to the data controller? And what is the data controller's liability to the end user? These are all important questions that that need to be figured out or have to be figured out before a production solution comes into play. I would also mention that there is also a question comes up, whether all of that data, all of personal data is subject to the right of erasure. I think, as Miguel pointed out, there are certain types of data that could possibly be stored for indefinitely. Real estate transactions come to mind. Because I'm not giving any legal advice here. So I think that also needs to be clarified as a community as a whole, and also by the European Data Protection Board, as to what are the various classes of data, of personal data in particular, that will have the appropriate attributes, or that need to have the properties of rectification, modification, and erasure.
Thank you. So I suspect our audience is a mixture of business and technical folks. Probably aren't a lot of policy wonks out there that get up every morning thinking, oh, let me read the latest on this law or regulation. So with that in mind, from a business side, from a technical side, what can people who are building blockchain solutions do to think about GDPR from the start? Because it's clearly not something you can just address at the end and take a few measures. So what are some of the best practices that people can use to make this, build it into their system, build compliance in, maybe?
Well, well, first of all, the GDPR has some principles. Privacy by design, it's one of them. And from the beginning of the development of the project, you should think about the protection of the data. What data are you going to put, if you are going to put some data on the ledger? And as Salman said, it's not advisable to put personal data on a ledger, at least for now. It's not advisable. And you should take that into consideration. Also, data minimization, that you should really think about what information do you really need from the data subject, and try to minimize it as much as possible. And having that data stored for the least amount of time. So you are protecting yourself. So you have to keep in mind the consumer protection in the end. It's going to be crucial when you're building your project.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Sylvia just said, and would add there's probably an initial sort of threshold question, which is this even something I need? Do I need blockchain to build my solution? And if yes, then you say, okay, what kind of data will be stored on the blockchain? As we've all said, the preference is to not store personal data on the blockchain to begin with, because if you don't, you're going to you're going to run into some of these tricky questions we've talked about in terms of immutability and the permanence of that data and accessibility of that data, et cetera. So once you're into this world where you have a blockchain, you have personal data, then all of the questions that Sylvie just mentioned are really right. And you need to think about privacy by design principles. You need to think about data minimization, all of these things. Once you've sort of sorted all of that out, then I think at the back end, regardless of what your solution looks like, one big thing, and this is something that we stress to clients all the time, because sort of the thought is, okay, once we've sorted out all of these blockchain questions, then we're done. But really, there's an extra step you have to think about, which is just general good governance and governance of your data, governance of your data protection questions. The GDPR has, and this is not just a GDPR thing, by the way, there's good governance on data like all over the world, regardless of GDPR. But you need to be thinking about how is this data stored, how are we protecting it, what are our security solutions, do customers have access to this data? If somebody needs to access their data or change their information or just inquire about their information, who are they going to reach out to? Who are they going to talk to? And how are issues going to get escalated up the chain? So these are all things that companies need to be thinking about when designing any solution. But certainly, when it comes to something as complicated as a blockchain implementation, these are things that need to be thought about.
Yeah. Thanks. What are some resources people could use to understand this better? Do you have favorite pointers or something you can point people to that they could use to maybe understand how GDPR can impact their design?
I will point out that the GDPR provides a figure that is the data protection officer. And in some instances, especially if big companies, you should have a data protection officer. It's not that it's a must, but I think it's a good starting point because that figure will know the GDPR inside and out, and it will know your organization and will help you navigate through the GDPR. And it's an advisor. It has to be independent from the company, and it's supposed to be an advocate for the data subject, but at the same time, it will help you to navigate through all the processes that have to be established, like Joe says, security and all those stuff to better implement GDPR.
So what, GDPR is relatively new, right, since last May. People have been getting used to it. Where do you think this goes? What's the future look like for blockchains and GDPR and other regulations around the world?
Well, I would like to just add something to that note. GDPR is new, but at the same time, it's not so new. It brought some new stuff like the right of erasure, portability, the consent, what is it? In terms of territorial scope. But apart from that, it's pretty much the same as the directive. What it brought was a regulation across all the European Union, because at the beginning we had the directive, but every single state was pretty much doing their own regulation. So now it's going to be just a unified regulation. But apart from that, just to answer your question, what we are seeing right now in the world is these companies are struggling with GDPR because pretty much what they have to do is meet the higher standard. And right now, I think GDPR is the highest standard in terms of data protection. So I think we're going to see that companies around the world just adopting GDPR in other jurisdictions, creating and regulating in a similar way as GDPR is doing. That's my opinion.
I think if I may add, what a GDPR has made us think about is, it has put focus on the issue of data privacy. So in the EU context, right, But what about global context? Right? Is data privacy a fundamental human right that needs to be enshrined in perhaps as part of the UN Millennium Goals or as part of some UN charters that is then certified and ratified by all the countries? So I think one of the fundamental contributions, at least in my opinion, of GDPR is raising that level, that awareness that was needed for the protection of personal data. But we are not done, and we will not be done until we have agreed upon principles, which are agreed upon and ratified by all the countries in the world to protect the privacy of the entire citizens of the entire globe.
Thank you. So I wanted to make sure we had a few minutes for any questions from the audience. If there are people who have questions, I'm happy to pass you a mic and let you ask questions of the panel as well.
My question is for Salman. Thank you for being here. You mentioned something that I think is really, really interesting. That when we look at GDPR, we need to understand what type of data needs to follow the principles, For example, if you look at legal claims or information that could be interesting for public interest, we see in Article 17, I think it's 3.e, that if we see information that is constituted a legal claim or that is interesting for public interest, the public interest prevails upon the right to be forgotten. As Miguel said, GDPR was started to come into the game in 2012. We see it now in 2017. A lot of years have passed, a lot of technological advancement. What are organizations like IBM doing to update this already outdated regulation? Because what I see when I look at GDPR is I see a lot of goodwilling, a lot of hope, but that it's already outdated. We are not covering. We see, for example, the principle of data portability that wanted to give space to kind of a future data market, but this is not being specified, it is not being said, and it's creating more problems than advantages. Therefore, I think that people in the space, people in the industry, we need to participate actively into kind of the conversation into where, as Phil was saying, where does GDPR go and how it's gonna, because I think that right now, sorry, I'm getting very long, but I think right now a lot of what we are doing is trying to fit our solutions to GDPR. And it's like, I think this is kind of a backward mentality. We need to continue advancing and regulation needs to come with us.
So, I think I agree with what you said, and regulations have to be updated to reflect the current state. And as people are rolling out compliance with GDPR, people are also realizing the cost of that. And on one hand, there is privacy and protection of personal data. On the other hand, there is the cost of doing that, and there is also the concern that are we opening some new potential holes or creating new sort of silos of personal data where all the personal data is stored in one place because of GDPR, and therefore attackers know where to go and potentially get it, which can be better protected also, but also raises its own set of concerns. So yes, the regulations have to be updated. They're typically the last ones to be revised. The technical advances come much earlier. And IBM works with all the government organizations as well as stand bodies to advance the latest in terms of technical development.
So do any of you see, what's the attitude of the European Commission on engaging with people and talking about how the regulations work and what could be changed?
Well, I think that the EU is making steps. Obviously, regulators are going always slower than technology. We have the EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum, where they are creating working groups and forums for the community to talk and chat and present problems and solutions. Also, they establish the European Blockchain Partnership, and next year they're going to establish an international partnership or association of blockchain applications that is a collaboration between the public and the private institutions. There's a lot of banks there. So they are taking steps to learn about the technology, and I think in that sense, regulatory sandboxes are a good option too. We have seen regulatory sandboxes in the UK with the fintech industry, and they have been very successful programs. So I think it could be a good idea for a collaboration between the innovators and the regulators to learn from each other, from the innovators to educate the regulators. And at the same time, the regulators can learn what are the patterns in the technology that they could be implemented to some legal guidelines. And of course, in the European Union, the public policy is to have the regulation technologically neutral. So it's not the policy to specify or to do a regulation about a super specific technology, and just to be a little bit more neutral so it can protect the rights of the citizens in any technology. But I think steps are being taken, but of course it's going to be a slow process to reach to a place where you can amend or do new legal guidelines. I think in that sense also, like we have heard, blockchain is in its early stages. So I think that in the end they will wait and continue to learn before they take steps towards amending the regulation or doing some legal advances in that sense.
Good. Thank you. Other questions? You guys in the back, you can ask questions too. I'll come to you.
Thanks, guys. Great talk. Quick one. From one side, you mentioned that it's advisable not to store private data on the blockchain, but from other side, you said that you cannot also hash it and store it on the blockchain. So what kind of reference actually you can store then on the blockchain?
Yeah, I think that's probably a panel in itself, where what are the various techniques that can be used to store personal data on chain. So first of all, don't store personal data on chain, and if it is unavoidable, one can use various pseudonymization techniques. And so what are those pseudonymization techniques? And more importantly, have those pseudonymization techniques been vetted by the GDPR folks, commissions in the EU? In the absence of that, we can, from a solution perspective, from a blockchain solution perspective, one can take a very conservative approach to ensure forward compliance, future compliance. But there are some clear anti-patterns. Don't encrypt personal data and store on blockchain, because encryption can be broken in future, and you cannot have the deletion. Don't simply do a hash. But I think beyond that, it's more of a discussion, more of a careful engineering that's involved.
Yeah, I would like to add something to that. So actually, you can store anything on blockchain. I mean, it's about what and how are you going to manage that. The thing about personal data, because from regulator perspective, personal data is not just your name or where you live. I mean, it could be pretty much anything that can identify you. So we heard about Bitcoin and public keys in some cases being considered personal data. So said that, I have to say that even though you're managing personal data and it's on the chain, even plain text, and again, as I said at the beginning, that doesn't mean that you have for sure to deal with right of erasure. But it's completely unadvisable. Just as Salman said, I mean, even if you encrypt the data, even in the future, you can expose some personal data that is very much, it could be a problem. But it's going to be case by case, but the answer to Sharon is yes, you can do it. You had to handle that in the right way. But it's not like, again, I want to say this. It's not like you cannot store information on the chain. I know people think, but if I cannot store public keys, why I'm using blockchain? What's the point of blockchain if I have to store information off-chain? Yes, you're right. But at the end, you have to manage the regulation. So it's going to depend on what are you doing with the data, and if you find exceptions from the regulators, and then you can pretty much do that. If not, don't do it. And yes, you have to use off-chain information in that case.
So we probably have time for one more question, and Drummond is signaling me that he has one, so.
It's actually triggered by what you just said, and it's not specific to Sovrin, but any self-sovereign identity system that wants to use blockchain. The number one problem we're solving for an individual is to make their assertions about their own data and their ability to share it and credentials safe, right, with cryptography. So therefore, it is about sharing of the public key, which, as I understand it, is absolutely considered personal data.
It's considered, this is the tricky part, and actually, I mean, I disagree with regulators, to be honest. Public key by itself doesn't identify you. I mean, it cannot say anything about yourself. But if you combine that information with even third-party organizations' information, and actually there's a case about dynamic IPs and somebody complaining, hey, but I don't have the information from the internet service provider. Yeah, but if you combine that information with the IPs that you're registering from the users that are in your web page, then you can pretty much identify them. So, you know, at the end, you can solve this in the court, but we don't want to reach that point. So at the end, it's about the possibilities of combining that information, which is not clear. But yes, you can have public keys, and if you are not able to link to anybody, then it's not personal data.
So let me sharpen that question. Let's say an individual decides to use that public key to enter relationships and share information where in those contexts that it will be identifiable. But what we've done is provided them with utility to share that data under their control in a safe way. Do you believe the EU Commission will ultimately decide that that use of an immutable public ledger is worth it and assigned with their goals, even if you couldn't go and you know, erase the data from an immutable ledger?
Well, because you're going to, yeah.
So,
Sorry.
yeah, maybe I can make a strong statement. I think it will be a mistake on part of EU's Commission to, let's say that, you know, the Sovrin or any other distributed identity network needs to be shut down because they're providing a way of sharing public keys. But I think at the same time, you know, the harm, as we always know, not only the harm, but the goodness, the business value is derived from linking of data, right? We all do that. We build cloud systems, we link CPU data with memory data to derive some information. But, you know, the same thing when turned on personal data can be used for harm. And I think that's the gray area, right, where there are no sort of clear answers. And that's something that has to be figured out.
Thank you. You know, I think it's easy when we're in the heat of the moment trying to design the system that we just know is going to add so much value to people's lives, to think about GDPR and privacy in general as a barrier we have to overcome, something that is standing in the way of us bringing all this great value to people, right? They're just going to love our ads or whatever it is we're doing. I teach a class at BYU on decentralized systems, and at the end of that class, I tell my students that they have an obligation to build the world that they want to live in. And I think all of us have that same obligation as we're designing blockchain solutions. We need to build solutions that enhance human dignity. And to do that, privacy is a feature, not a bug. So I'd encourage you to all think about that as you consider GDPR and how it applies to your blockchain projects. And thank you very much. Thank our panelists, and have a good day.